mysterious 8-year-old boy solves an impossible equation inside the headquarters of a cold, work-obsessed tech billionaire and says just one sentence that shatters the man's entire world. "My mom taught me, you really don't remember us, do you?" A buried past resurfaces, and for the first time he must learn how to be a father. But is it already too late? Marcus Kutcher couldn't recall the last time he'd looked into a child's face. Maybe it was at a charity fundraiser, a meticulously color-corrected PR photo, or perhaps just a fleeting glimpse of a small face on a magazine cover. Not enough to make him pause. His work didn't allow it, nor did his emotions. His company, Kutcher Dynamics, wasn't a place for spontaneity. Every step was measured, every answer optimized. So when the PR department suggested hosting a family day to boost internal culture, Marcus signed off on it the way he'd sign a printer order, swiftly, coldly, without so much as a furrowed brow. And naturally, he had no intention of showing up. But then, for some reason even he couldn't explain, there he was, standing in the grand lobby of the headquarters in a suit less crisp than usual, with a name tag dangling awkwardly from his belt. Children's laughter echoed from a corner of the room. Microchip-shaped cookies, toy robots, whiteboards scribbled with basic algorithms. It all made Marcus itch, as if he were strolling through someone else's memory. Someone who once knew how to laugh, how to play, who once had something resembling a heart. He glided past clusters of people. His eyes never lingered on anyone for more than 3 seconds. He was about to turn away when a crowd gathered in the R&D hallway stopped him cold. They were laughing and looking astonished. Marcus didn't like crowds, and he especially didn't like laughter in the research wing, a place he'd once dubbed the morgue of creativity. But then he found himself walking toward it, his steps unconscious, his eyes narrowing. A large screen, a painfully familiar interface. That equation, the human behavior prediction algorithm model, a failed project, one Marcus himself had labeled infeasible and relegated to the data graveyard, though it had once been the wildest ambition he'd ever harbored. Half the AI professors had given up on it. The other half burned through the budget in failure. No one should have had access to it, and sitting in front of that interface was a boy. He looked about 8, wrinkled hoodie, slightly messy hair, one shoelace still untied, but his fingers danced across the keyboard, fast, decisive, unflinching. The screen displayed clean, streamlined lines of code, not a child's random game, real thought. Marcus stood, frozen. A line of people parted for him, drawn back by some invisible gravity. No one dared speak. No one dared breathe too loudly. The boy pressed enter. The screen processed. The model stuck for years suddenly ran smoothly, as if its errors had never existed. A long string of data appeared. Simulation successful. Graph lines steady. Results viable. Marcus's hand clenched. His lips went dry. Who had given this kid access? Who dared let a child touch top-secret property? He leaned down, lowering his voice just enough not to scare him. "Who taught you to do that?" The boy turned. His eyes were clear and bright, but not sparkling, not innocent like other children's. He looked at Marcus as if he'd known him before. A silence stretched out, long like the toll of a bell in an empty church. Then the boy gave a faint smile, not a joyful one, but the quiet smile of someone who'd once hoped, and then stopped. And he said, "My mom taught me." "You really don't remember us, do you?" Whispers rippled through the crowd like waves, but Marcus heard nothing else. That sentence, simple, soft, drove a nail into his chest. The boy turned back to the screen, closed the windows. Every movement was neat, mature, like an adult's. No explanation, no demands, no accusations. He walked past Marcus, not hurried, not afraid. Only Marcus remained there, like a man whose carefully built world had just crumbled in a single sentence. He didn't know who the boy was, but his heart had just begun to remember something vital he'd tried so hard to forget. Marcus's penthouse sat on the highest floor, where the city lights couldn't quite reach the dark corners he'd deliberately left untouched. That night, he didn't turn on the lights. He didn't play music. He didn't pour a drink. He just sat there, silent, as if his body had been drained of power and his heart forgotten how to beat steadily. On his phone screen was an unsent message. "Eli, your name is Eli. Who are you?" But Marcus didn't send it, because deep down, he was afraid. Afraid of the answer. Afraid the boy was right. Afraid that amid the milestones, the funding rounds, and the polished speeches, he'd lost something. No empire he owned could ever buy back. He stood, moving unconsciously toward the deepest corner of the room. A dusty old cabinet he hadn't touched in nearly a decade. The bottom drawer was always jammed. He'd never called anyone to fix it, never wondered why, just ignored it, like he ignored anything that didn't yield profit. Tonight, he kicked it hard. For the first time in years, the drawer gave way. Inside was dust, time buried alive, and a worn leather notebook. Hedges frayed, pages yellowed like tarnished memories. Marcus picked it up. His hands trembled. He remembered this notebook, but he hadn't thought of it in a decade. He sank into a chair and opened the first page. Familiar handwriting, small, neat, a little rushed but never sloppy. Clara. Her name hit him like ink seeping back into his skin. Clara, the first woman who'd ever made him feel small. She wasn't good at presenting, but she was brilliant at seeing the core of things. She didn't think in straight lines like he did. Hers were winding, emotional, strange, and right, in ways no one could predict. They'd worked together in the early days when the company was small, just a startup with dreams bigger than its budget. Clara helped him see paths that he, the self-proclaimed master of logic, had overlooked. And then they fell in love. No one admitted it, no one defined it, but it had been real. Until one day, she vanished. No warning, no demands, nothing left behind. Except this notebook, tucked in a drawer that had stayed jammed for nearly 10 years. Marcus flipped through the pages, drafts of formulas, behavioral analyses, red-inked notes in the margins. Behavioral data is just the surface. We need to quantify perception. Near the end was a draft of the very equation Eli had solved today, but incomplete. Close, so close. Marcus froze. She hadn't abandoned the project. She'd taken it with her when she left. She'd kept going. Not for the company, not for money, maybe just for passion. Or for the child she'd raised alone, the child named Eli. On the final page, a single line stood out, written in shakier but resolute handwriting. Some things are more important than being right. Marcus closed his eyes. That was the day she left. He remembered it vaguely. She'd stood at the door, hand on the knob, looking at him as if she wanted to say something monumental, and he'd been busy reviewing quarterly reports. She'd said, "I don't want to live in the shadow of someone who only loves being right." He hadn't responded, hadn't asked, hadn't stopped her, because he thought she'd come back. Who walks away from Marcus Kutcher? But she had, taking with her the one thing he never knew he'd had. A family. Dawn was breaking. Marcus still sat there, hand resting on Clara's notebook, as if it were the last piece of his life that held human warmth. He didn't cry. He'd forgotten how tears felt. But deep inside, something was cracking. Not memories, but belief that he'd lived correctly. For the first time in years, Marcus didn't know what came next. He only knew one thing. He needed to see Clara again, not to demand anything, but to ask one small question. "Eli, is he my son?" The road out of the city had no lights. Marcus drove in silence, with only the headlights casting beams across shadowed streaks of trees. The GPS instructed a left turn, then a right, but his heart didn't know where it was heading. All he knew, Something inside was pulling him forward, as if failing to find answers now would strip him of the courage to ever search again. Her house, Clara's, sat quietly on the outskirts, nearly an hour's drive from the city. A single-story home with a gray slate roof and walls lightly covered in moss, as if no one had cared about its appearance for a long time. A small bicycle leaned against the porch. Marcus stepped onto the stoop, his hand brushing the weathered wooden door. He hesitated, just for a second, then knocked, once, twice. The door opened, and there stood Clara. Not exactly surprised, not angry, not joyful, just silent. Her gaze met his like it was touching a memory left forgotten too long. Marcus meant to say something, a greeting, an apology, a smile, but it all caught in his throat when he saw her eyes. Tired but not weak, empty but not cold. I wasn't sure I should open the door. I wasn't sure I dared to knock, Marcus replied. A pause. Then Clara stepped back, widening the door without another word. He stepped inside, into the home where she'd lived a life without him. The space was small but warm, not because of the furniture, but because of the traces. A child's jacket draped over a chair, tiny robot models scattered on the table, and the faint scent of chamomile tea lingering in the air like a whisper. Here we lived, kindly and quietly. Clara turned to the kitchen counter, pouring more water into a kettle as if Marcus were just a neighbor dropping by. He stood in the middle of the room, unsure whether to sit or ask to leave. "This is about Eli, isn't it?" Her voice was soft, so soft, but enough to throw Marcus's heartbeat off rhythm. "Yes, but not just Eli." Clara set the mug down without turning around. "I don't want to hear why you disappeared, or why you think you have the right to come back. I don't think I have the right." "Then why are you here?" Marcus swallowed hard. No ready answer came. He glanced around, a handwritten note on the fridge, a scribbled drawing taped to the wall, a man standing beside a child holding a computer. No faces, just shadows. He stepped closer, pointing at the drawing. "Is that me?" Clara turned, her eyes meeting his. No avoidance. Eli's imagination of his father. The words, simple to the point of cruelty. Marcus looked back at the drawing. In it, he was just a black, nameless shape. A void, a figure with no eyes, no mouth. Not alive enough to be present, just enough to be absent. "Clara, you never said anything. All those years. You never asked. If I'd known, I would've." "Don't." She cut him off, soft but sharp. "Don't say things as a version of you that never existed." Marcus fell silent. Her words weren't harsh, weren't insulting, but each one was like a shard of glass, clear and cutting. He sat down, feeling for the first time in years, small in the room of a woman he'd once loved but never truly understood. "I'm not here to take anything back," he said, his voice slowing. "I just need to know if Eli is my son." Clara sat across from him, a slight nod. "Yes." No climax, no tears, just the truth falling between them, so light it made Marcus struggle to breathe. "His full name?" "Eli Mercer, my last name." Marcus nodded, trying to keep his hands from trembling. Clara looked straight into his eyes for the first time. "He doesn't need a father showing up out of guilt." "No," he replied, his voice deepening. "He needs a father, even if he's late, but still chooses not to walk away." Silence. Outside, the wind picked up. A light rain began to fall. Marcus looked at Clara, still that same face, but now carrying a life he hadn't been there to share. He didn't apologize. Because some things apologies couldn't mend. They could only be quietly stayed for, if the other allowed it. The next morning, Marcus returned. No heads up, no flowers or gifts, just a paper bag with 2 bagels, a coffee, and a small orange juice carton. He stood at the door like a student late for his first day of school. Hesitant, awkward, he knocked 3 times, so softly, as if hoping she wouldn't hear. But the door opened anyway. Clara said nothing, she just tilted slightly to one side. He took it as a signal enough to step inside. Eli was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by a mess of wires, components, and a small robot that looked like it had just undergone half-finished surgery. The boy looked up, unsurprised. He simply asked, "You here today, too?" Marcus nodded, managing a stiff smile. "If you'll let me," Eli shrugged, his eyes already back on the wire he was attaching to a circuit board. "As long as you don't blow me up." The morning passed with the clatter of tools, the low growl of a 3D printer in the kitchen corner, and silence. But it wasn't the stifling kind anymore. It was the kind of silence that allowed people to be present, even if they didn't yet know what to say to each other. Marcus sat beside Ellie, not daring to touch anything, but trying to look engaged. Every time he started to ask something, the boy either answered preemptively or brushed it off with a simple, "I'm thinking." And oddly enough, Marcus didn't feel offended. For the first time, he wasn't the one leading, he was the one following. A student, an outsider, peering into the world of a boy who was frighteningly smart and heartbreakingly warm. By noon, Clara handed each of them a sandwich and a can of soda. They ate on the floor, backs against the sofa. Eli didn't say much, but when Marcus popped the soda can too hard and it sprayed onto his shirt, the boy laughed. The first laugh, small, but it lingered in Marcus's ears. "You don't know how to open a soda can?" "I've forgotten a lot of things," he replied. How to be human apparently included. Eli didn't respond, but he looked at him a little longer. In the afternoon, they tested the robot they'd assembled. It turned its head, blinked, then let out a boom, as if mocking them. Eli cheered. "It's alive!" Marcus watched the boy, his face alight, hair messy, hands still greasy. A strange feeling welled up in his chest, something soft, fragile, blooming from a place that had been frozen for so long. Yes, joy. Not from achievement, not from possession, just the simple joy of seeing a child smile. When it was time to leave, Eli stood by the door, hands in his pockets. "Will you come back?" Marcus was caught off guard, not by the question, but by the faint hope tucked behind that casual tone. "If you'll let me, I will." "Then bring more orange juice. The kind from today was good." Marcus drove home, his hands still smelling of components and breadcrumbs. But in his mind, only one thing echoed. "Will you come back?" That question, seemingly small, made him feel like he'd just been tested. Not by a board of shareholders, not by market metrics, but by a boy who only needed someone patient enough to show up sincerely. Marcus knew if he wanted to be a father, he'd have to start over, not from books, not from strategies, but from learning how to be human. A person who listens, who lets silence exist, not out of arrogance, but because he's learning to feel. A person humble enough to knock and persistent enough to wait, even if he's not guaranteed an invitation inside. Clara didn't invite Marcus to stay for dinner. She just opened the fridge, glanced at the leftover ingredients and said softly, "I cooked a bit too much," and so Marcus stayed. No reason needed, no formalities required. He stood by the kitchen table snapping green beans while Clara sliced carrots into thin slivers like threads of time. Neither said much, but they didn't need to. Marcus watched her hands, still those slender, nimble fingers that once typed for hours, once sketched virtual models as if toying with fate. Now those hands were chopping vegetables, flipping pancakes, washing dishes, as if they'd chosen an entirely different life and lived it without needing anyone to witness. He wanted to ask her, "Are you happy?" But he knew that question was a kind of sin. Eli sat at the dining table, legs swinging, hands neatly placed beside his plate. He didn't know how to put on an act. He didn't know how to feign joy or sadness. He was just himself, and that was what made Marcus feel a mix of tenderness, confusion, and regret. "Are you a vegetarian?" Eli asked as Clara ladled soup. "No, but I'm trying to eat things that aren't loneliness," Marcus answered. Without thinking, Eli blinked, then giggled. Clara turned her face slightly away. It wasn't clear if she was smiling or hiding something. They began eating in silence. No background music, no TV, just the sound of spoons clinking against porcelain bowls, breaths just audible, and the rain starting to patter on the porch outside. Clara poured more water. Marcus chewed slowly. Eli stirred his soup lightly with a spoon as if conducting an experiment. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Did you and Mom used to work together back then?" Clara paused for a second. Marcus answered first, his voice lower. "Yeah, we were a team, a reckless one." "And now?" Eli asked, not sharp, not probing, just a boy who wanted to know. "Now? I'm learning how not to do everything alone." This time Clara didn't look away. She looked at him, truly, deeply, not angry, not forgiving, just beginning to see someone who'd once disappeared. When Marcus took a second bite of the baked bread, he said quietly, "Clara, it's better than anything I've ever eaten on a business class flight." She shrugged. "No pilots here, no quarterly goals, just a old gas stove and two people fighting over the soup spoon." "That's exactly what makes it special." That offhand remark softened the air around the table. Something old, familiar, fragile, like the hint of ginger in the soup, began to drift back, unnamed, unshaped, but both of them felt it. After the meal, Eli stood and quietly gathered the plates into the sink. Clara started to move, but Marcus got up first. "Let me wash." "You? I still know the difference between a bowl and a glass for how to use dish soap. You can check my work later." Clara smiled, faintly. It was the first real smile since he'd stepped into this house. Marcus turned on the faucet. His hands fumbled, clumsy enough that he laughed at himself. Water splashed onto his shirt. Soap suds spilled over the basin. Eli stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching. "You wash dishes like you're programming AI, overcomplicating everything." Marcus glanced at Clara. She was wiping the table with a cloth. Her eyes sparkled with a joy she didn't show, but no longer hid. As he left, Marcus turned to Eli and bent slightly. "Thanks for letting me eat with you. I know that's not a given." Eli nodded, then said, very quietly, "I've never seen Mom smile when someone reads a story with the wrong voice like that." Marcus blinked. "She smiled?" "Once. When you did the robot voice and mispronounced him emotional, she covered her mouth, but I saw it." Marcus didn't reply, but inside something flared up, like a small flame in a rain-damp kitchen. For the first time he understood. The day of Eli's school presentation was unusually sunny. Marcus had taken the day off, a first, unless it was for a medical emergency or an economic collapse. He wore a tieless shirt, buttons misaligned, and let Clara fix them without protest. "Are you nervous?" "No, just I've never been to a parent-teacher meeting. This is a presentation, not a shareholder conference." "That's what makes it scarier." Clara gave a faint smile, but Marcus noticed her hands were colder than usual when he held them. The classroom was small, with neatly arranged desks and chairs, kids bustling about and parents fumbling with phones and cameras. Marcus sat in the second row. Clara beside him, hands clasped together. Eli stood at the front, one hand holding a neural network model, the other pointing at a slide. "I want to build a computer that doesn't just react, but understands. Understands emotions, not just analyzes them." His voice wasn't loud, didn't tremble. His eyes were bright, his forehead creased slightly under the glare of the lights. Marcus tilted his head. This child was his son. No test needed, just watching Eli stand there, between logic and emotion, was proof enough. The boy continued. "For example, if someone says I'm fine but their eyes look down, the system would know." Then Eli faltered. The room went silent. Marcus sat up straight. Clara frowned. The boy swayed slightly. His hand dropped the model. His eyes widened, as if someone had flipped a switch in his mind. And then Eli collapsed, not like a child tripping, but like a machine unplugged. Sudden, swift, without even a sigh. Clara was the first to rush forward, screaming his name. Her voice didn't sound like her own, as if someone were tearing her heart out through her throat. Marcus froze for 3 seconds, then snapped awake. He yanked out his phone, called emergency services, shouting into the receiver. An 8-year-old fainted, not breathing, unresponsive. The classroom erupted into chaos. The teacher burst into tears. A little girl screamed. Someone sank to the floor, and Marcus, the man who'd managed million-dollar crises, for the first time in his life didn't know what to do beyond holding his son's hand and repeating in his head, "No, no, no." The hospital was stark white, colder than usual. Clara stood by the door, her face pale as paper. Marcus paced like a wounded animal. Each step left invisible scratches on the floor. A doctor emerged, a gray-haired man with eyes already heavy with sorrow. The boy had a congenital heart defect, very rare, very hard to detect. We tried everything, but Marcus didn't hear the rest. His ears rang. Clara sank into a chair. No wails, no tears, just her hands clenched tight, as if trying to strangle the pain before it could spill out. They were allowed into the room. Eli lay there, small, light, thinner than Marcus remembered. The breathing tube was gone. The monitor no longer blinked, only the deep sound of the IV drips faint ticking, with nothing left to deliver. Clara sat down. She placed a hand on his hair, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "My love, Mommy's here." Her voice didn't shake, it was just hollow. Marcus stood on the other side. His hand trembled as he touched that tiny, now cold hand. He whispered, almost inaudibly, "I'm sorry, you didn't get to." "I didn't." Suddenly, Eli stirred, just a little. His eyelids fluttered open briefly, then closed, a thin, fragile breath, and then he whispered, "Don't be sad. I had everything. You two were my favorite part." And then he stopped. Not gradually, not struggling, just stopped. Clara screamed. Marcus could no longer stand. The world, once so still, shattered without a sound. The funeral took place 3 days later. No press, no PR, just the people who truly knew who Eli was. Clara wore his old sweater. Marcus sat in the back, silent. No one cried aloud, because this pain had no sound. It was a vacuum in the chest. On the small coffin, only an inscription: Eli Mercer, loved deeply, missed always. No birth date, no achievements, no titles, just a name that had touched the world and left before it could respond. Clara disappeared right after the funeral. No warning, no address left behind, not a single message. Her car turned onto a tree-lined road, and Marcus just stood there in the cold wind, unsure if he should run after her or let her go. He didn't choose either, because he was already too late for everything. Marcus's penthouse returned to its usual stillness, but now, hypothetical situation that never happened. The silence wasn't something he used to escape anymore. It was a glass-covered tomb. On the fridge, Eli's scribbled drawing still hung, a half-folded paper airplane he never finished, a notebook on the table holding the emotion computer project, the one he didn't get to complete. Marcus didn't dare touch them, nor could he bring himself to put them away. At night he lay on the sofa, not for comfort but because the bed felt too far from Eli. Autumn slipped by like a whisper someone forgot to send. Then winter came, and one day Marcus got in his car and drove north. No plan, no schedule, just a name his assistant had left on the desk: Clara Lakes, cabin, oak forest. He found the small house after 3 hours of driving. Slanted roof, smoke curling from a low chimney. A moss-covered bench sat on the porch. He knocked, once, then twice. Clara opened the door. Her face was thinner, hair tied back hastily. Her eyes weren't sad anymore, just empty. But when she saw him, she wasn't surprised. She didn't ask why. She just stepped back and left the door open. Not an invitation, not a stay, just not locked. The days that followed drifted like a dream without a plot. Clara swept the porch. Marcus chopped wood. Neither mentioned Eli. Neither spoke of having once loved each other. They just existed, two shadows side by side under a winter tree. Then one evening, Clara brought out a small wooden box. She lifted the lid. Inside were ashes. Marcus didn't ask. He just nodded. They walked to the lake's edge, where the wind was gentle and the water still enough to ache. Clara stepped close to the water, her hands trembling as she scattered the ashes, handful by handful. Marcus joined her, doing the same. Each speck of dust was an unsaid word, an unrecorded memory. After the last handful, Marcus knelt. His head fell into his hands. His shoulders shook. No sound, just he couldn't hold his shape anymore. Clara sat beside him, placing a hand on his back. She said nothing, but through her breathing he knew she was breaking too. From the inside. "He forgave us," she whispered, "but I haven't forgiven myself." Spring crept in quietly. Buds sprouted on the porch tree. Birds nested under the eaves. Clara started drawing again. No more technical models, just streaks of color, blue, yellow, purple, like formless souls. Marcus fixed up the small kitchen, repaired the door handle, remade the drawer. He didn't need control, just needed to do something with his hands. For a space that could breathe. One day, Clara walked into the living room holding a pregnancy test. No words needed. Marcus looked up. "Really?" She nodded, then burst into tears. For the first time, not for loss, but for having. He pulled her into his arms. His hand rested on her lower belly, where another life was beginning. "I'm scared," he whispered. "Me too." But this time, "I'll be here, for every moment." Clara didn't reply. She just took his hand and didn't let go. 2 years later, they lived in a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, no tech gadgets, but every wall was painted together. Every mug was from a weekend market trip. Every scratch on the floor was a mark from a tiny pair of feet. Learning to walk. Lena. She didn't cry much, but her eyes were big and bright, like someone had come back to life in her. When Marcus held her, he'd whisper, "You have a big brother named Eli, and you carry his light too." On the living room wall, Clara painted a starry sky. In the center was the biggest star, slightly tilted like it was smiling. Below it, a small line read, "Loved forever, missed always." Guiding still, they didn't try to forget. They didn't replace. They learned to live beside the void and let light slip through the cracks.